Okay, first of all, assalamu alaikum and greetings to everybody for coming, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me. I begin in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Now, the title of this evening is Islam and Feminism, Compatible or Conflicting? First of all, can everybody hear me at the back? Yes. Okay, great, thank you. Now, the mere fact that some people decide to call themselves Muslim feminists is not really proof that Islam and feminism are compatible. And one of the greatest ironies, perhaps, is that such feminists regularly affirm through their own work that feminism and Islam are not compatible unless Islam changes to fit feminist ideas. Now, some feminist groups, like Sisters in Islam and Musawa, instead of reviving Islam, often you find them demanding reinterpretations, repudiations, or the reformation of Islam in order to actually align it with Western secular liberal beliefs. Now, for example, they openly advocate the cherry picking of prophetic traditions that they like, i.e. hadith, and rejecting those they don't like. So Keisha Ali, for example, some of you may have heard of her, she claims that contemporary believers are permitted to adopt hadith when it agrees with contemporary Western ethics, but to reject it when it contradicts them. So there's this cherry picking going on. Aisha Chowdhury, in one of Musawa's publications, justifies rejecting hadith that they do not like by stating that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was a patriarchal man who belonged and was comfortable in 7th century Arabia. And she asks readers to take advantage of the pliable nature of prophetic reports. And when it comes to Quranic interpretations, some of you may have heard of Amina Wadud and Asma Lamrabit. They also outrageously argue that the Islamic injunction for a wife to obey her husband in what is halal, obviously not in that particular circumstances which you referred to, contradicts the oneness of God, as they claim that obedience is for God alone. Now, if obedience to the husband is idolatry, then according to such feminists, a boy obeying his mother would also be idolatry. A citizen being a law-abiding person would also be idolatry. And a Muslim obeying the Prophet, peace be upon him, which the Quran specifically requires, would also be idolatry. Now, Amina Wadud, who is a founding member of Sisters in Islam, she went even further when she infamously said with regards to Quranic text, personally, I'm quoting, she says, personally, I've come to places where how the text says what it says is just plain inadequate or unacceptable, however much interpretation is enacted upon it. And she says further that when she disagrees with the Quranic text, she says, there is the possibility of refuting the text to talk back to even say no. So does this sound like feminists themselves think that Islam and feminism are compatible? Doesn't really sound like it. Now, they also claim, for example, that gender roles do not exist in Islam because of the principle of equality or musawa. Now, interestingly, the Quran doesn't actually use the word musawa or any of its derived forms, except when it's saying not equal are belief and disbelief. This is the only instance in which you'll find that this term used. Rather, the Quran recognizes that no two people, regardless of gender, are given the same provisions, blessings, or tests, and in the afterlife, similarly, people are ranked and rewarded differently. So people are treated with and promised justice in the Quran, not a blanket equality. It's not proposing a kind of communism. But due to its somewhat shallow thinking and assessing the worth of individuals in materialistic terms, what feminism ends up doing is dehumanizing the very sophisticated Islamic injunctions in the Quran that relate to family and marriage. And whilst it advocates intersectionality in diagnosing problems, it fails to appreciate the interconnectedness and the checks and balances that actually exist within the Sharia itself. And its individualistic worldview means it fails to look beyond the individual and appreciate the foresight that the Sharia has in preventing certain injustices. Now, this means that feminists who need to argue that Islam is male biased cannot really explain why in Islam a woman has a right over her husband's time, his money, and even his body. And so they cannot therefore also accept the Islamic rulings on inheritance, spousal obligations, rulings on family leadership, modesty, and so on. And by constantly demanding that Islam has to change, feminists are openly admitting that it is not compatible with Islam. So it's not me saying it, this is feminists saying it. But what exactly do they want Islam to change into? Now, feminists such as Asma Balas, Ziba Mir Hosseini and others openly write that they're trying to, and I quote, reconcile Islam with modernist conceptions of justice, feminist theories, Western conceptions of human rights, and contemporary Western ethics. In other words, they're not acting as interpreters of the text, but rather as secular liberal interpolators, in some ways missionaries. Now, instead of reviving classical Islamic understanding and inspiring creative liberators in the Muslim world, we see such feminists unfortunately trying to strip away the Islamic mechanics and safeguards for justice. And instead of helping Muslim society out from its post-colonial backwardness, which it is in and is facing a lot of problems because of, such feminists seem instead to be trying to complete the colonial project by pushing for the full imitation of Western ideologies. Now, this is not compatibility, brothers and sisters. This is a forced marriage and followed by a forced conversion. Now, Amina Wadud also talked about the frustrations that Muslim feminists feel when they have to pretend to argue feminism from an Islamic perspective and not a secular liberal perspective. So she writes in her book, the executive director of Sisters in Islam, Zaina Anwar, once asked, why can't we say we are working for gender justice from a human rights perspective instead of our earlier claim of working for a gender-inclusive Islamic perspective? And Amina Wadud commented, quite honestly, I understand the frustrations. So in other words, feminists seem to want to bring Muslims towards secular liberalism in the same way that sometimes missionaries from other religions will use the Quran to try to bring Muslims to other religions. Now, where exactly do these secular liberal values lead us, if that's where they're trying to take us? So let's look at what they consider to be the utopia, their vision of what the West actually is. Now, in the UK, where it has 100 years of feminism it's led to a lot of unintended consequences. So today, women receive preferential treatment in the criminal justice system with lighter sentences, preferential domestic violence support and cancer research, despite statistics showing that men are often vulnerable at similar or higher rates. It's led to education gaps, with women excelling ahead of men at universities and in entry to employment. It's led to women being liable to pay alimony to ex-husbands in the event of divorce. And the individualistic denial of mutual legal rights and duties between men and women in marriage has led to a frustration and isolation for both genders. And it's led to rising divorce rates. Women are socially and economically compelled to work. It's not out of choice, and often socially compelled by the fashion industry and the media to dress in revealing clothing and sexualize their appearance in order to be validated by society. Men can sleep with women without any legal commitment, and so many are now turning away from marriage, and women have to provide for themselves. So if anything, it could be argued that men might be happier here in the West than they would be in these so-called patriarchal Muslim countries. Domestic violence also continues to exist in shocking proportions, including against men and including amongst lesbian couples as well. And men and women both continue to be judged according to their gender rather than their merit. So is this what Muslim feminists are proposing or advocating for the Muslim world? Now, going back to the text, we encounter the fundamental problem with feminist interpretation. If we point to the Quran or Hadith as evidence for why Islam and feminism conflict, many feminists will simply reply, those texts are metaphorical, they're not to be understood literally, or the texts are historical, they're only for that time, they're not for this time, despite those verses being mubin, which means clear or unambiguous. Now, seeing as the Quran and Hadith, which I've talked about this evening, are fundamental to Islam, and seeing how Muslim feminists make excuses for rejecting these texts today or openly admitting to saying no to them, simple common sense would dictate that Islam and feminism are conflicting. But seeing how Muslim feminists seem to remain unfazed by this, I propose that we need a falsification test for this topic. And that is that if feminists don't consider the Quran and Hadith conflicting with Islam to mean that Islam conflicting with feminism, to mean that Islam conflicts with feminism, then what would be sufficient evidence to show that Islam and feminism are conflicting? If it's not the Quran and Hadith, what else is there left to show conflict? What evidence would they accept without making these excuses? Now, I invite you all this evening to think about what conflict would look like, and other than overly wishful thinking, have we not already witnessed this conflict between Islam and feminism? Thank you for your time.